Greetings, brothers and sisters. Tonight is October 1st, 2024. It's 8:15 p.m. And this is Dr. Julius Nairi, CBPM, Division 421, African-Centered Study. We are finishing up the reading of the text Race First, and I am Brother John Hargrove, serving as president for Division 421. Our first Lady Vice President and Education Coordinator, Sister Diane, is unavailable this evening, so I will be hosting. And let me see. So we will pick up from the reading that we left off on 2 weeks ago, completing chapter 11, NAACP and Integrationists. Any questions before we get started? Okay. All right, well, start the recording and
His life was in many ways the sad and torturous story of a man drawn by training and upbringing to white aristocracy, yet too sensitive to ignore the racism that buffeted him and his race. During his life, he moved impatiently from one tactic to the next, from one philosophy to the next, in a frustratingly vain quest for the elusive formula that would overcome the formidable monster of white racism, and, more especially, American white racism. And so it was that Du Bois came to Garveyism. When Garvey was deported from the United States in 1927, Du Bois was already an old man, less than 3 months short of his 60th birthday. He had already tried intellectualizing the race problem away. He had long given that up in favor of agitating it away. He had tried socialism and integration and more. Yet, sometime around 1930, Du Bois began going the way that George Padmore was soon to follow. The major difference between the two was that Padmore was more honest about the influence of Garvey on causing black communists to reconsider their positions than Du Bois was in the case of his own switch from integration to separation. No sooner was Garvey out of the way than Du Bois was overcome by a deep disillusionment with the integration that he had defended so stubbornly. He increasingly came to realize that for all his effort, for all the effort of the NAACP, integration was making little headway. De facto school segregation had increased in the North, and lynchings, though less frequent, were no less brazen. He therefore now began to argue that since integration was an apparent impossibility for the time being at least, then black people might as well make the most of separation. He talked of a nonprofit cooperative racial economy that would operate within American capitalism but not be of it. This racial economy would in time incorporate the West Indies. He even began, with the terrible tragedy of the Depression, to voice Garvey's pessimism about the survival of the African race in America. Du Bois had in the past threatened separation if America denied the black man equality, but these were but fleeting glimpses of his uncertainty. Now, however, it was different. One of the first to notice the change in Du Bois was Garvey himself. After reading a Du Bois commencement speech at Howard University, Garvey, from Jamaica, loudly accused Du Bois of now preaching Garveyism. This was in 1930, and Du Bois had referred in that speech to the need for a black economic base. In 1931, the Negro World made the same point. Page 1 headlines declared, "Dr. Du Bois agrees with UNIA leader, takes program over finally, but does not openly confess it, emphasizes Negro-owned industries business." This new line of thinking led inevitably to a break between Du Bois and his integrationist employers at the NAACP. Du Bois, in his own words, was now advocating new deliberate and purposeful segregation for economic defense. In 1934, he and the NAACP parted ways, leaving the crisis in the capable integrationist hands of Roy Wilkins and George W. Streeter. Garvey, alluding to Du Bois's late arrival at the philosophy of racial economic self-reliance, commented, "It is no wonder Du Bois has resigned from the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. He can go no farther. Can he continue abusing the white man when the American Negro is at the white man's soup kitchen?" Du Bois, meanwhile, while steadfastly refraining from giving Garvey credit for his new position, sought to make his peace with the ghost of Booker T. Washington, claiming now that he had not opposed Washington on segregation grounds. Other observers, however, noted the Garveyite sound of Du Bois' new pronouncements. George Streeter wrote soon after, "It is significant that the Garvey idea, however much it was ridiculed by Negro intellectuals during the heyday of the movement, has not downed. On the contrary, it reappears in the most unexpected quarter. For example, in the currently expounded Du Bois doctrine of a black economy." And sociologist E. Franklin Frazier, himself no great lover of Garvey, observed, "When Garvey proposed a grandiose scheme for building a black commercial empire, Du Bois ridiculed his naivete. But what could be more fantastic than his own program for a separate nonprofit economy within American capitalism?" Frazier, having written Du Bois off as the marginal man who could not discover his identity, prophesied, correctly as it turned out, that Du Bois would not remain a separatist for too long. He wrote in scathing tones, "Du Bois's racial program needs not to be taken seriously. He has only an occasional romantic interest in the Negro as a distinct race. Nothing would be more unendurable for him than to live within a black ghetto or within a black nation, unless perhaps he were king, and then probably he would attempt to unite the whites and blacks through marriage of the royal families." When Garvey attempted his genuine racial movement, no one was more critical and contemptuous than Du Bois of the fantastic glorification of the black race and all things black. Garvey's movement was too close to the black ignorant masses for Du Bois. On the other hand, he was more at home with the colored intellectuals who gathered at the Pan-African Congresses. In England, meanwhile, Garvey summed up his conflict with Du Bois. He summarized Du Bois's great shortcomings in a sentence: "He has no racial self-respect. He has no independent ideas. He has nothing of self-reliance about him, and that is his great trouble." In Du Bois, moreover, Garvey saw no evidence of any independent long-range thinking on strategies to emancipate the race, such as had characterized Booker T. Washington's program. Garvey saw Du Bois's outstanding contribution rather as a negative hostility to the most important programs for liberation in his time. Garvey wrote in 1935, "When Du Bois dies, he will go down in his grave to be remembered as the man who sabotaged the Liberian colonization scheme of the Negro, the man who opposed the American Negro launching steamships on the seas, the man who did everything to handicap the industrial and commercial propositions of the American Negro, the man who tried to wreck the industrial educational system of Tuskegee, the man who never had a good word to say for any other Negro leader, but who tried to down every one of them." The short-range, more spontaneous nature of the Du Bois NAACP conception of a program of liberation was well expressed by Du Bois himself in 1921, when he explained that the NAACP is organized to agitate, to investigate, to expose, to defend, to reason, to appeal. This is our program, and this is the whole of our program. This is exactly what Garvey meant when he said that Du Bois had no program. Concerning the charge of constant hostility to the programs of Garvey and others, Du Bois wrote later, "In his case, as in the case of others, I have repeatedly been accused of enmity and jealousy, which have been so far from my thought that the accusations have been a rather bitter experience. The Du Bois-Garvey conflict dominated the conflict between the NAACP and Garvey, but Garvey had his occasional exchanges with other NAACP leaders. In the case of one of them, William Pickens, an extended controversy developed, which was second in intensity only to Garvey's struggle with Du Bois. The case of Pickens is important because not only was the personal animosity generated as great, but the ideological disagreements which surfaced were the same as those of the Du Bois-Garvey conflict. The coincidence of the positions of Du Bois and Pickens in their separate conflicts with Garvey underlines the real ideological character of the differences between the NAACP and the UNIA. Pickens joined the NAACP in 1920 as Associate Field Secretary. He was a graduate of Yale, class of 1904, and, like some of Garvey's associates, had been a member of Du Bois's Niagara movement. When he joined the NAACP, he was a vice president of Morgan State College. Even before he joined the NAACP, if Pickens's very unreliable later testimony can be believed, he had received an offer or offers from the UNIA. After about a year with the NAACP, Pickens began expressing dissatisfaction with the organization. He was counseled by Du Bois in March 1921 to be loyal nevertheless. He decided, however, to explore the possibility of alternative employment with the UNIA. Amy Jacques Garvey recalls that he phoned Garvey and subsequently visited his apartment twice. He told Garvey that his pay was insufficient even though he did more work than his colleagues, and he was being discriminated against because of his color. Garvey offered him a job until the August convention, at which time he could run for office. Pickens, however, had no real intention of joining Garvey at this juncture, but was merely skillfully and with extreme callousness using Garvey in an attempt to exact more money and a position of greater authority from the NAACP. He was therefore able to temporize with Garvey until safely after the August convention, although he addressed a Liberty Hall audience on August 30th. On September 12th, however, when his conflict with the NAACP was reaching a head, he wrote Garvey an effusively flattering letter, which, in the light of later events, was a calculated deceit of the greatest magnitude. The letter claimed that Pickens was doing well and really did not need a change of job except for the great feeling of the great opportunity to aid the supreme enterprise which you are undertaking, and which you have been urging me for some time to consider. Undaunted by his intended treachery, he assured Garvey, "I know you have dealt with many traitors and have still traitors to meet. They infest the world. But trust me, if I never worked in the same organization with you, I should still be your brother." A mere 5 days later, on September 17th, Pickens submitted his resignation to the NAACP Board of Directors, effective no later than November 1st, but preferably on October 1st. He claimed that he would continue to uphold the aims of the association. Strange talk for a prospective Garveyite. It transpired that the October 1st preference was due to his promise to speak to the colored people of New York on October 2nd. On September 25th, doubtless in response to NAACP attempts to settle his problems, he informed the association's treasurer that whereas he would have received substantially more had he succumbed to earlier offers, his biggest current offer was only about the same as his current salary, plus his earnings from occasional lectures. On September 29th, he refused an invitation to attend a meeting of the NAACP's executives to discuss his resignation. "The next move," he scribbled on the bottom of the invitation, "belonged to them, and I let them take it." The executives, nevertheless, refused to accept the resignation and appointed a committee to investigate. The committee recommended an increase in pay and a reorganization of fieldwork to give Pickens a larger directional part, thus overcoming his two major grievances. Pickens's ploy had thus succeeded. That he had merely used the UNIA, he himself confirmed. Concerning Garvey's offer of temporary employment until the 1921 convention, he explained, "This I decided to try out for all it was worth. If I should have to leave the NAACP, which I never wanted to do, if it could be reasonably avoided." Sometime during the course of these intrigues, Pickens wrote an article for The Nation at that magazine's request. It was written before the resolution of his conflict with the NAACP. The result was so effusively pro-Garvey that the magazine's editors suspected a hoax. On October 11th, one day after the NAACP Board of Directors accepted the recommendation to increase Pickens's pay and authority, he had to assure the Nation's editors that he had not in fact taken them for a ride. He claimed that the article had been written before he began to entertain the possibility of joining Garvey, and that he would write exactly the same article now that his conflict with the NAACP was settled. The Nation published an expurgated version in December. The Negro World published the full article a week and a half earlier. It also appeared in the Black California Voice on December 31st, 1921, together with a Pickens Christmas greeting to the UNIA. The California paper introduced the article with the headline, "Field Secretary NAACP Analyzes and Endorses Garvey Movement." The article itself praised Garvey's emphasis on race, defended his regalia while not agreeing that it was necessary, supported his business methods, his steamship line, and his honesty, and saw no necessary contradiction between the international operations of the UNIA and the domestic emphasis of the NAACP. Pickens even argued that there was no reason why the same person could not belong to the Urban League, the UNIA, and the NAACP, and yet talk consistently in an interracial Congress in Atlanta, Georgia. The unexpurgated version even suggested that a West Indian leader and a black movement in the United States were the perfect combination for racial emancipation at that particular time. Where there was criticism, as on the light-skinned question, it was mild. In February 1922, Garvey proclaimed his high regard for Pickens, whom he considered above meanness of any kind. In March, a Negro World editorial came to Pickens's defense when the Cleveland Call inquired, "What side of the fence is Pickens on?" Pickens seems not to have informed Garvey of his intention to remain with the NAACP, even after receiving his increased salary and settling his dispute, for in May 1922, Garvey again extended an offer to him. In June, Pickens privately made a fairly favorable appraisal of Garvey. He praised Garvey's international organization, but this time opted for the NAACP's domestic struggle as a quicker remedy for emancipation of the race in America. He opposed emigration to Africa, but conceded that Garvey's program was the greatest menace of the time to the white world. His remarks are important because they came just before the Marcus Garvey Must Go campaign, of which Pickens was shortly to become one of the leaders. Perhaps as a harbinger of things to come, he seemed to anticipate the persistence of the Garvey idea after the departure of Garvey himself. He wrote, "As to the Garvey movement, it is not perfect. No movement is. But Garvey has the right idea that all Negroes of all countries, and especially of the Western world, should be in touch and organization with each other. I know Garvey personally, and I do not regard him as a crook. He is somewhat of a visionary. All such men are. He will not fail, although he himself will not see the great success of his plans. The idea he has injected into the Negro masses will stay, even if Garvey should be jailed or hung. The whole world today, the large white world, outside of places like Shreveport and Mississippi, are more concerned over the Garvey idea than over any other move the Negro has ever made for power in the modern world. They know that to effect an international organization is to reach out for real power, especially through masses of men. But I am with the NAACP, although I have been offered as much as $10,000 a year to join other forces, and the offer still stands. I believe in the earlier fruition of the sowings of the NAACP for the good of Negroes in the USA. Colored Americans will make regrettable mistakes if they help white Americans to fight the Garvey idea. The idea is all right, if only Garvey can get rid of some of the crooks that have infested his organization and speak plain about organization of the racial group and not try to fool anybody about the Back to Africa myth. On July 10th, Garvey invited Pickens to accept an honor at the forthcoming August UNIA convention for his exemplary endeavors in the service of the race. By this time, however, the Marcus Must Go campaign was firing its first broadsides at Garvey, and Pickens had aligned himself with it. On July 24th, he replied angrily. His reply showed quite clearly that, like Du Bois, he could be driven to great rage by Garvey's more extreme separatist manifestations, in this case, the summit conference with the Ku Klux Klan. Pickens considered absurd any deal with the Klan by which, as he said, America was accepted as a white man's country in exchange for assistance in making Africa truly a black man's continent. He believed, he said, in Africa for the Africans, black and white, and in America for all colors. Up to this time, Pickens had done nothing worse than mislead Garvey to obtain a salary increase. From now on, he was to be a central figure in the most vituperative campaign ever waged by Afro-American leaders of importance against a major rival. Marcus Garvey must go. The Marcus Garvey Must Go campaign represented essentially a temporary alliance of convenience between black socialists, represented principally by A. Philip Randolph and Chandler Owen, some black Urban League officials, the NAACP, and miscellaneous other black integrationists. It represented a formidable coalition of the most influential black integrationist leaders in the land. Many of them had previously crossed swords with one another in their competition for leadership of the Afro-American masses, and many were to cross swords after the removal of Garvey, but for the moment they were willing to cooperate in the face of the Garvey steamroller which threatened to crush them all. Among the more important personalities leading this campaign were, first of all, Randolph and Owen. They represented the radical wing of the non-communist integrationists, being more prone to intemperate speech and voluble pratings concerning the class struggle and the scientific nature of their program. In many respects, however, they differed little from the mainstream integrationists in the NAACP. The NAACP's major representatives in this campaign were Pickens and Robert W. Bagnall, its director of branches, with Du Bois, of course, playing a key supporting role. The executive board of the National Urban League in New York provided two of the campaign's leaders in John E. Nail and Harry H. Pace. The Urban League, too, was mainstream integrationists. Many of the campaign's leaders had previously been engaged in acrimonious disputes with Garvey. Bagnall, a preacher, had almost attempted to throw Garvey out of his church in Detroit when Garvey tried to integrate it by sitting up front among the light-skinned folk during his early years in the United States. Robert S. Abbott, editor of the Chicago Defender and another leader of the campaign, had been sued for libel by Garvey in 1919 for attacks on what he called the Jim Crow Black Star Line. Abbott, as the editor of one of the leading Afro-American newspapers, presumably did not appreciate the competition from the fast-growing Negro world and Garvey's attacks on his race-demeaning advertisements. In 1920, Abbott engineered Garvey's arrest on a technicality while he was on tour in Chicago. Garvey's previous contacts with Randolph and Owen went back much further. Randolph claims the distinction of having given Garvey his first opportunity to address a Harlem audience. The year was 1916, and Randolph was addressing a large gathering from his soapbox at the corner of 135th Street and Lenox Avenue. Someone pulled on his coat and said that a young man from Jamaica wished to speak. Garvey did speak, and, according to Randolph, you could hear him from 135th to 125th Street. After his speech, Garvey sat down near the platform with paper, stamps, and envelopes, busily engaged in sending out his propaganda. Garvey's 1917 speech denouncing the East St. Louis riot was presided over by Chandler Owen. This cordial relationship continued into 1919. From July 1919, W.A. Domingo, himself a socialist, was listed as a contributing editor of the Messenger while simultaneously editing the Negro World. Many of his articles appeared in the Messenger up to and beyond his resignation from the paper. In 1919, Randolph was actually chosen by Garvey as one of his representatives to the Paris Peace Conference. The trip never materialized. Randolph later claimed, at the height of the campaign against Garvey, that the first big mass meeting ever held by the UNIA was under the pretext of sending him to this conference. Garvey's collaboration with these socialists was doomed from the start because of the incompatibility of their advocacy of integrationist interracial class struggle with his own ideas of race first. His dismissal of Domingo, therefore, coincided with a break with Owen and Randolph over these principles. The Messenger itself, in December 1920, acknowledged the ideological nature of the split. It editorialized, "At one time, the editors of the Messenger spoke from the same platform with the moving spirit of the organization in question. Then, the Black Star Line idea was no part of its effects, nor were the slogans Negro First and African Empire, Back to Africa, and extreme race baiting prominent in its program." Siding with Garvey in this schism was Hubert H. Harrison, who left the Socialist Party, as he explained in 1917, because as a firm believer in the American doctrine of race first, he wished to put himself in a position to work among his people along the lines of his own choosing. Harrison was referring to himself here in the third person. Increasing the ranks of these dedicated integrationists of long standing was the inevitable occasional opportunist who seized the time to grind some personal axe against Garvey. The outstanding representative of this category was J. W. H. Eason. Elected UNIA leader of the American Negroes in 1920, Eason had maintained this position until his expulsion during the 1922 convention. Eason it was who, in 1920, had been slated to occupy the UNIA Black House in Washington, D.C., a most unintegrationist gesture. A few months before his departure for the UNIA, he had expressed a fervent desire to go to Africa. "But if I never go," he implored his UNIA audience, "I want you, American Negroes, when you make your future exodus from this country, to take my bones with you and bury them in the motherland." 4 months later, he was saying that he left the UNIA because there were enough problems in America without having to get involved in Africa or anywhere else. In June, he claimed to be impressed by white Mississippi segregationist Senator McCallum, whom he had interviewed. McCallum had suggested that black people should see about their own affairs. In August, on the eve of his expulsion, he was accusing Garvey of joining the KKK. The truth of the matter was that Eason had been formally impeached and expelled from the UNIA for 99 years in lengthy legal proceedings at the 1922 convention. His impeachment had arisen out of charges of a large number of financial and other irregularities, some of which he admitted. These matters had come to the attention of Garvey and had been substantiated by his auditor, J. Charles Zampty, during an extensive tour throughout the United States prior to the convention. Once expelled, he reinforced the Integrationist campaign by holding anti-Garvey meetings all over the country under the nominal auspices of his hastily organized Universal Negro Alliance. He traveled through many of the same areas that he had only recently toured on behalf of the UNIA, this time repudiating his former Garveyite opinions. Sometime during this period, it was announced that he would be the star witness against Garvey in the latter's forthcoming trial. The swiftness and comprehensiveness of his about-face did not go down well with Garvey's supporters. At a Chicago meeting, 31 of the 35 who turned up to hear him were loyal Garveyites keeping a wary eye on him. After this meeting, shots rang out, leading many to believe, in the words of the Negro World, that Eason had paid the price of the traitor. The shots, in fact, were the result of some unconnected altercation. The following night, he had an audience of 6. In New Orleans in October, he spoke to 32 persons where a few months previously, as Garvey's representative, he had on 4 occasions addressed full houses. Worse was yet to come. In January 1923, he was shot dead after addressing an Emancipation Day meeting, again in New Orleans. The Negro World called his murder a dastardly act and suggested an illicit amorous entanglements as the probable cause. 2 Garveyites were arrested and charged with the murder. The UNIA initiated a defense fund for them, and they were eventually acquitted. A third suspect was almost cornered at a UNIA meeting in Detroit, but detectives inquiring after him were detained at the door by members of the Universal African Legions long enough to enable the suspect to escape through a rear exit. The UNIA, meanwhile, disclaimed any complicity in the assassination. As in the case of Du Bois, the Integrationist coalition made Garvey's separatism and Allied doctrines its main objects of attack. There was also the very non-ideological question of what one study has called the crisis of confidence in the Urban League, and certainly in other organizations, when, despite white philanthropic help, they could not raise anywhere near the sums that Garvey could from his black followers. Indeed, both John E. Nail and Harry H. Pace, the 2 major Urban League figures in the anti-Garvey campaign, were at the time members of the Urban League's Finance Committee. The effect of Garvey's doctrine of racial separation in forcing these integrationists to come together is highlighted by the squabbling that went on among them prior to, and for a short while after his rise to prominence. In 1917, for example, the Messenger had attacked Du Bois, Pickens, and others. In 1918, it called Du Bois, Pickens, James Weldon Johnson, and others a discredit to Negroes and the laughing stock among whites. Similar attacks came in 1919 when Randolph referred to these 3 as typical Negro reactionaries. In December 1919, Pickens, responding to attacks from Owen and Randolph, said that he respected socialism, but not the cheap brand practiced by these 2. He advised the white socialists to find more suitable material for work among black people or face continued failures. And as late as December 1920, the first overt Du Bois comment on Garvey charged that early in 1919, Chandler Owen had presided over a large mass meeting in Harlem's Palace Casino. At that meeting, Du Bois charged, Garvey and Randolph addressed the audience and $204 was collected on a claim that Du Bois had obstructed Garvey's High Commissioner in France by repudiating Garvey's statements on American lynching and injustice. The Messenger had attacked Du Bois in September. By the time of Du Bois's article, however, Pickens had begun to make his peace with Owen and Randolph. He had also, if he is to be believed, already been approached by Garvey. One of the earliest muffled shots in the coalition's campaign came in May 1920, when the founding meeting of the Friends of Negro Freedom took place in Washington, D.C. This group was to play an important role, at least nominally, in the campaign. The meeting was convened at the initiative of Owen and Randolph, who were to become its joint executive secretaries. The list of those invited showed that already there had been some closing of Integrationist ranks, for several NAACP local officials were among them. These included Archibald Grimke, president of the Washington, D.C. chapter, who had formerly been written off as reactionary by Owen and Randolph. Among the other invitees were Robert W. Bagnall, Carl Murphy, editor of the Baltimore Afro-American, and historian Carter G. Woodson, who, unlike most of the others, usually managed to discreetly avoid becoming involved in attacks on Garvey. Later on, this Owen-Randolph-inspired Integrationist coalition reached out to embrace the communist assimilationists, for the name of Cyril Briggs appeared on the Friends of Negro Freedom letterhead. The pre-campaign hostility of Owen and Randolph to the communists, which was reciprocated in equal measure, was as great as that toward other elements of this coalition. The first meeting of the Friends of Negro Freedom was scheduled to be held less than 2 weeks after the 1920 National Convention of the Socialist Party. Here, Owen and Randolph, together with W. A. Domingo and Thomas E. A. Potter, were seen as playing the same kind of role as the African Blood Brotherhood was to play for the communists. They were to spearhead the socialist drive among the black masses. The Friends of Negro Freedom were doubtless, among other things, a manifestation of this role. The new organization was also thoroughly integrationist, it being specified that it should be interracial, though black-led. In the months that followed, Owen and Randolph continued their attacks on Garvey's separatist program. Owen declared in August 1920, "We educated, scientific-minded, and higher-minded Negroes do not want a Negro nation. It would forever kill our dream of world equality." The Messenger also opposed the slogan, "Africa for the Africans," because, it argued, oppression knows no color. By October 1920, the magazine had come to the conclusion that the UNIA was not a promise but a definite menace to Negroes. Among Garvey's menacing attributes were his advocacy of a black political party in the United States. Garvey's African program especially came under repeated attack. Randolph argued that Africa was almost totally colonized and so could not be taken. Garvey, he thought, was a tool of white racists in that he diverted black aspirations into unattainable goals. On this point, Randolph compared Garvey unfavorably with the Zionists, whom he claimed did not advocate conquest. "The keen mentality of the Jew," he pontificated, "recognizes the suicidal folly of such a policy." He did recognize, however, that Garvey had made a useful contribution in his necessary and effective criticism on Negro leadership, in his popularization of black history, in his instilling of an attitude of resistance toward whites, and in motivating black people to follow black leadership. These attacks, serious as they were but a prelude to the real campaign, which may be said to have gotten underway with the appearance of the July 1922 Messenger. The very first editorial screamed starkly, "Marcus Garvey!" Once again, and not for the last time, Garvey's separatist utterances had driven the Integrationists into a frenzy. This time, the casus belli was a Garvey speech in New Orleans. He was quoted as saying, in terms reminiscent of Booker T. Washington, that America was a white man's country and the black man could not insist on riding the white man's Jim Crow streetcar, since he had not built any streetcar of his own. This was too much for the messenger. Before the month was through, Randolph had commenced his anti-Garvey speeches in Harlem. Once the decision for all-out war had been made, Owen and Randolph dropped all pretensions of propriety in their attacks. Like the boys, they exploited to the full the most vulnerable chink in Garvey's armor, namely his foreignness, and this despite having previously disassociated themselves from attacks on Garvey's nativity. Garvey's incarceration and deportation were henceforth to be the main objectives of the campaign. "This fool talk, too," the opening salvo declared, "emanates from a blustering West Indian demagogue who preys upon the ignorant, unsuspecting poor West Indian working men and women who believe Garvey is some sort of Moses. All ministers, editors, and lecturers who have the interests of the race at heart were urged to gird up their courage, put on new force, and proceed with might and main to drive the menace of Garveyism out of this country." And just in case the message still had not been made clear, the following declaration of uncompromising hostility appeared. "Here's notice that the messenger is firing the opening gun in a campaign to drive Garvey and Garveyism in all its sinister viciousness from the American soil." At this point, Pickens entered the campaign. The Black Philadelphia Public Journal, for which he was a contributing editor, and the August Messenger both carried reprints of the July 1922 exchange of letters between himself and Garvey. In response to Garvey's offer of an award at the August UNIA convention, he had replied that he wanted no award from the KKK organization. By suppressing his former correspondence with Garvey, he created the impression that Garvey's advances were a one-sided affair, although he later admitted to having discussed a job possibility. He supported his entry into the campaign with a steady flow of news releases and editorials, many of them scurrilous, against Garvey. Garvey, for his part, lamented Pickens's about-face. "We believe that he was really a race patriot," he wrote, "and could have been harnessed for service to his race, but we find him, black as he is, smarting under the lash of a prejudiced crowd that has more venom than sense, more malice than race loyalty." Garvey also regretted his dishonesty in not publishing a further addition to the correspondence in which Garvey had rejected accusations of a link with the KKK and had challenged Pickens to a public debate. August, the month of Pickens's anti-Garvey debut in the Messenger, was also the month of Garvey's convention. The back page of the Messenger proclaimed, as thousands of handbills were soon to do, "Marcus Garvey must go." There followed notice of anti-Garvey meetings in Harlem for each of the 4 Sundays in August. The speakers would be Pickens, Bagnall, Randolph, and Owen. Handbills described this quartet as 4 of the most distinguished scholars, nationally noted orators, famous debaters, deep thinkers, faithful, unselfish, fearless, devoted, and incorruptible public servants in the cause of Negro freedom. The NAACP's involvement was underscored by the addition of Du Bois and James Weldon Johnson to the names of the 4 speakers as persons who had taken the correct line while in the South, which Garvey allegedly had not. It was made clear that the attacks would largely revolve around the Black Star Line, and hence the African program, and the Ku Klux Klan question. The meetings were held under the auspices of the Friends of Negro Freedom. The UNIA convention, not unnaturally, opened amid much tension. A large police contingent was on hand for the opening parade, during which a few minor skirmishes took place between marchers and bystanders who were brave enough to echo the charges of the rival camp. During the course of the month, Garvey challenged the campaigners to a public debate. Randolph, was reported as having said that the Afro-American would be just as out of place in Africa as the white man. 3 Africans wrote to the New York Times protesting Pickens's denigration of the motherland during an anti-Garvey meeting, and Walter White, Assistant Secretary of the NAACP, sent an unnamed gentleman from the West Indies to Randolph with interesting anti-Garvey information that Randolph was glad to receive. Around this time, Randolph received through the mail a packet containing a human hand. The hand had red hair on it and was therefore presumably that of a white person. An accompanying letter scolded Randolph for not being able to unite with his own and gave him a week to join his Nigger Improvement Association. It was signed KKK. Whether the hand came from the Klan or Garvey or was posted by Randolph to himself has never been established. In any event, Randolph concluded that the Klan has come to the rescue of its Negro leader, Marcus Garvey. He conveniently omitted from the article which drew these conclusions the fact that the hand was white. This event was balanced by rumors that the campaigners were considering having Garvey assassinated. In between the abuse, the very real ideological objections to Garveyism continued to surface, among them being his African program. Africa for the African, said Randolph, was devoutly to be wished, which did not imply that we recognize the ability of the Africans to assume the responsibilities and duties of a sovereign nation at the present. In November, the crisis came to the assistance of the campaign by attacking a UNIA handbill distributed through Harlem countering the charges of Randolph and Company, and the Messenger published a list of the 12 smallest persons in America. Garvey naturally headed the list, followed by such persons as a Ku Klux Klan leader, Jack Johnson, and one John S. Williams of Georgia, who had buried 13 black people alive. Throughout the campaign, the brunt of the attack was borne by Owen and Randolph and, to a lesser extent, by Pickens and Bagnall, a useful indication of how little they had been able to carry prominent non-Garveyite and even anti-Garveyite Afro-American opinion with them was provided by Owen and Randolph themselves. They sent a questionnaire to 25 of the most prominent Afro-Americans, including some nominal members of the Friends of Negro Freedom and some of the most active campaign members. The recipients of the questionnaire included Du Bois, Carter G. Woodson, Bagnall, Kelly Miller, Emmett J. Scott, Robert S. Abbott, Carl Murphy, Archibald Grimke, and others. The questionnaire was accompanied by a letter of so-called facts alleging Garvey's involvement with the Klan and responsibility for the human hand affair. 14 persons replied. Of this number, Du Bois referred them to the crisis and declined to answer further, and Woodson discreetly pleaded lack of sufficient knowledge of the Garvey movement to answer meaningfully. Of the remaining 12, no less than 5 were soon to be signatories of the notorious anti-Garvey letter to the Attorney General, and thus were among the most strongly committed of the anti-Garvey campaigners. Yet, out of a total of 25 questionnaires and 14 responses resulting in 12 effective replies, heavily biased by the inclusion of anti-Garvey campaign members, only 4 agreed with Owen and Randolph that Garvey should be deported. Among those against deportation were Emmett J. Scott, Carl Murphy, Kelly Miller, Archibald Grimke, and campaign member John E. Nail, who would soon be coaxed into changing his mind and signing the pre-deportation letter to the Attorney General. Abbott of the Chicago Defender, another signer, declined to answer that question. Those who favored deportation were Harry H. Pace of the Urban League, Bagnall of the NAACP, both signers of the letter to the Attorney General, Thomas W. Talley of Fisk University, and J.B. Bass, editor of the California Eagle. The beginning of 1923 found both Pickens and Bagnall listed as contributing editors to the Messenger. The year opened disastrously for the anti-Garvey campaign. J.W.H. Eason was shot dead in January. At this stage, the campaign was in a very precarious position indeed. For about 6 months, the campaigners had poured forth a torrent of anti-Garvey rhetoric backed up by meetings all over the United States and in Canada. Garvey's great influence over the mass of people was evident everywhere. In New Orleans, Chicago, Toronto, Harlem, and elsewhere, they were subjected to threats, harassments, and intimidations by Garveyites. Their meetings regularly had to be held under police protection. The campaigners' list of complaints was impressive. An Eason meeting in Philadelphia, stopped by the police to prevent bloodshed after persons attempting to attend were knocked down and insulted by Garveyites congregating outside. A veritable riot in Cleveland, Ohio, led by Garvey's deputy, Dr. Leroy Bundy, against anti-Garvey elements. Chandler Owen narrowly saved by the police from Garveyites rushing the streetcar on which he was riding in Pittsburgh. Pickens intimidated by Garveyites in Toronto. A Chicago policeman shot by a Garveyite during a fracas after an anti-Garvey meeting. Campaign meetings in New York invaded by scores of Garveyites. A campaign speaker slashed after an anti-Garvey meeting in Cincinnati. And now, Eason dead. It was at this stage that the anti-Garvey Crusaders decided to enact one of the strangest episodes in Afro-American history. They decided to write and publicize widely a letter to the Attorney General. In effect, they were moving to openly enlist the support of the United States government in overcoming their major rival. Concerning this episode, Garvey commented, "It is said that there is honor even among thieves, but it is apparent that there is no honor and self-respect among certain Negroes." The notorious letter to Attorney General Harry M. Daugherty, signed by 8 leaders of the Marcus Garvey Must Go campaign, was dated January 15, 1923. This seems to be the date on which the draft was composed. It was in fact posted or delivered later, although the original date was not changed. Though signed by 8, the principal drafters were 4, the same 4 who had provided the initiative and most of the energy for the campaign so far. They were Randolph, Owen, Pickens, and Bagnall. The preeminent role of these 4 was stated by Bagnall in a letter to Arthur B. Spingarn, a national vice president and chairman of the legal committee of the NAACP. This letter to Spingarn proves, as if any proof were needed in light of the role of Pickens and Bagnall, that the NAACP was deeply implicated in the whole affair. In fact, Bagnall enclosed the draft to the Attorney General and requested legal advice. This was before the other eventual signers had endorsed it. Bagnall's letter read, "The enclosed is an open letter to Attorney General Daugherty, which we plan to have signed by influential colored people in various parts of the country. It was drawn up by a group of us, among whom Owen, Randolph, Pickens, and I were the principals. We wish to guard against any illegal statement, and we shall appreciate your advice on that point and as to the whole matter." Spingarn, or somebody else at the NAACP office, did examine the draft very carefully. Several over-exuberant portions were deleted. It seems quite safe to say that the version which eventually went to the Attorney General was finalized in the NAACP office, in all probability by Arthur B. Spingarn. It was apparently seen by other NAACP officials too, most probably Johnson and White, Secretary and Assistant Secretary, respectively, though they claimed that the NAACP, as an organization, had nothing to do with it. The letter attacked Garvey's anti-integration position. It said, "There are in our midst certain Negro criminals and potential murderers, both foreign and American-born, who are moved and actuated by intense hatred against the white race. These undesirables continually proclaim that all white people are enemies of the Negro. The UNIA was described as just as objectionable and even more dangerous than the KKK, inasmuch as it naturally attracts an even lower type of cranks, crooks, and racial bigots, among whom suggestibility to violent crime is much greater. Garvey's foreignness was once more exploited. His followers were described as mostly foreigners and voteless, the inference being that the government would not have to worry about losing their votes. To make the proposition even more attractive, Du Bois and Domingo were quoted as authorities on the worldwide membership of the UNIA, which was put at much less than 20,000. The letter also revealed the same type of integrationist elitism and snobbery which characterized Du Bois. The phenomenon of masses of black workers and peasants militantly organized and not afraid of violence if necessary was a specter as terrifying to black integrationists as it was to white people. The letter declared, "The UNIA is composed chiefly of the most primitive and ignorant element of West Indian and American Negroes," and more than half of the letter was devoted to a catalog of their violent acts. The UNIA Constitution was quoted to show that Garvey frowned on criminals except where their crimes were committed in the interests of the organization. The provision would doubtless have covered cases such as the conviction of UNIA members for resisting police attacks on their meeting places. It was presented here, however, as a positive incitement to crime. In two cases where matters were pending before the courts, the letter attempted to impress upon the country's chief law officer the probability of Garveyite guilt. These were the Eason case, where the UNIA officers arrested had professed their innocence through rejoicing in his death, and Garvey's own pending mail fraud case. They begged the Attorney General to vigorously and speedily push the government's case against Marcus Garvey for using the mails to defraud, since hosts of citizen voters of both colors earnestly desired it. The letter asked finally for Department of Justice surveillance of the UNIA and requested that the Attorney General use his full influence completely to disband and extirpate this vicious movement. The 8 signatories were Harry H. Pace of the Urban League and president of a phonograph corporation, Robert S. Abbott, publisher and editor of the Chicago Defender, John E. Nail of the Urban League and president of a real estate company, Dr. Julia P. Coleman, president of a cosmetic manufacturing company, William Pickens, field secretary of the NAACP, Chandler Owen, co-editor of The Messenger and co-executive secretary of the Friends of Negro Freedom, Robert W. Bagnall, the NAACP's director of branches, and George W. Harris, editor of the New York News and a member of the Board of Aldermen of New York City. Conspicuously absent from the list of signatories was the name of A. Philip Randolph, despite his major role in the affair. The Attorney General was requested to address his reply to Owen, the secretary of the Committee of Signatories. For Owen especially, this was a most sorry turn of events. His Messenger, in its early days, had unashamedly proclaimed itself the only radical black journal. And in 1919, the then Attorney General, A. Mitchell Palmer, had branded it the most radical Afro-American publication. Now, the socialist radical was begging the Attorney General to get rid of his rival, Garvey. On January 26th, Owen wrote another letter to the Attorney General. He suggested that the letter of the 8 be not given to the press since it was to be released throughout the country on February 1st. On January 30th, Carl Murphy, editor of the Baltimore Afro-American, inquired of the Attorney General what steps had been taken to disband the UNIA in accordance with the wishes of the 8. On February 4th, Garvey, now aware of the letter, informed the chief law officer that there was absolutely no truth in the allegations contained therein. The UNIA, he wrote, stood for the uplift of a downtrodden race. There was nothing disloyal about that. The Bolsheviks and socialists among the detractors he considered the real disloyal elements. Then, on February 20th, a remarkable thing happened. The Attorney General's office drafted a detailed reply to Owen endorsing his hostile analysis of the Garvey movement and promising possible further legal action against Garvey. The letter was apparently drafted by Assistant Attorney General John W. H. Krim. Krim, it is interesting to note, was later accused by Garvey of remarks prejudicial to his mail fraud case while it was still sub judice. Somebody, perhaps Attorney General Dougherty, had second thoughts about the reply, and it was not sent. The unsent draft read, "The Department is in receipt of your communication of the 15th ultimo addressed to the Attorney General by yourself and several others with particular reference to Marcus Garvey and the organization known as the Universal Negro Improvement Association. The Department appreciates thoroughly the facts recited in your letter with regard to the activities of this alien. The Department of Justice is very well acquainted with the details of his operations and is thoroughly satisfied that his schemes were formulated and have been executed to the great detriment of thousands of colored American citizens who have fallen as dupes and turned over to him innocently their meager savings in the hope that he would accomplish the impossible. Garvey has known this impossibility from the start, but like so many other organizations that have sprung up throughout the country, the propaganda has been a means of livelihood more satisfying than an honest occupation. It is unfortunate that so many of Garvey's dupes have been American citizens, a number of them the poorer Negroes, who could least afford to lose their meager life savings. It is with this knowledge that the government succeeded in having Garvey indicted in New York for the misuse of the mails in a scheme to defraud. As you are aware, this case is set for trial at a very early date, and the department has sufficient confidence to believe that the ends of justice will most certainly be satisfied before the entire matter is concluded. The government is thoroughly aware of the fact that Garvey does not and never has represented the American Negro. For many months prior to the preparation of this joint letter, the government has not been idle or unmindful of this colossal fraud, and at all times it is anxious to receive from the substantial elements of your race any information which will assist it in enforcing the laws of the nation and the suppression of movements such as the Garvey scheme. The details of your letter are being given very careful attention, and if sufficient evidence can be obtained on the several instances recited, you may rest assured that still additional action will be taken." This draft was replaced by a brief, more formal note of 2 sentences. Even this note, however, ended, "Please keep us advised in the event additional facts come to your attention." It is hardly surprising that the original draft was not sent. It would undoubtedly have found its way into the Messenger and the rest of the anti-Garvey press. And even in the context of Garvey's case, already hopelessly prejudiced by the efforts of Du Bois, the Friends of Negro Freedom, and others, this would have been a little too much. On February 26th, Owen, the would-be socialist radical, thanked Krim for his reply and reminded him that the 8 represented the most distinguished and responsible businessmen, educators, and publicists among the colored people of the United States. The letter of the 8 to the Attorney General was paralleled by one from Du Bois to the Secretary of State, branding Garvey as a thoroughly impractical visionary, if not a criminal, with grandiose schemes of conquest. Garvey responded at length to the charge of the 8. "My enemies," he said, and those opposed to the liberation of the Negro to nationhood are so incompetent and incapable of meeting argument with argument and tolerance with tolerance that they have cowardly sought the power of government to combat and destroy me. He concluded that this was proof of their weakness and inability to stand up under the onward march of African redemption and real Negro freedom. Like the good old darkies that they were, they believe they have some news to tell, and they are telling it for all it is worth. He denounced them as a bunch of assimilationists who wanted to hurdle the barrier into the white race. The UNIA was not, in his opinion, a hater of white people because it believed in the rights of all races. And he could not see how his maligners could simultaneously accuse him of stirring up ill feeling between the races and seeking an alliance with the Ku Klux Klan. Their main problem, he thought, was their inability to tolerate any organization that did not have white members. Concerning the alleged primitive and ignorant following of the UNIA, he was no less indignant. "Were it not for the ignorant element of Negroes," he retorted, "these very fellows would have starved long ago, because all of them earn their living either by selling out the race under the guise of leadership or by exploiting the race in business." He reaffirmed the ability of the UNIA to marshal more votes than all other black organizations in the United States put together, and affirmed that every second Negro you meet, if not an actual member, is one in spirit. And he prophetically warned them that by their actions, a precedent will be set for the destruction of all Negro organizations that seek in any way to improve the condition of the Negro race. Garvey's reply included a pen portrait of the 8. One was a business exploiter who appealed to race patriotism while overcharging for his products. Another was a race defamer of Chicago, whose paper loved to highlight the crime and vice of the race. He was the man who published in his newspaper for over 1 year a full-page advertisement showing the pictures of 2 women, a black woman and a very light woman, with the advice under the photograph of the black woman to lighten your black skin. The next was a real estate shark who charged higher rents than white landlords. Then came a hair straightener and face bleacher whose loyalty to the race is to get the race to be dissatisfied with itself. On the turncoat and lackey, who had used him to get a raise in a rival organization, he was particularly severe. Then came the grafter socialist, who had started sundry enterprises among black people without accounting for the funds. The 7th signer was Garvey's old adversary, the ex-pastor of a Blue Vein Society church in Detroit, Michigan, who was relieved of his charge for alleged immorality. Finally, there was the unscrupulous politician who had lost the respect of the masses. The response ended with an appeal to UNIA members to close ranks against this onslaught. By way of postscript, Garvey noted that all the signers were octoroons or married to octoroons. The sole exception, a mulatto and socialist, Owen, had tried to marry a white woman, but had been dissuaded by UNIA criticism. John Edward Bruce, ever faithful to Garvey, composed a poem for the occasion entitled 7 Little Colored Men. A typical 2 lines went, 3 little colored men, a-sitting in a row, remarked one to the other, "This Garvey man must go." The campaign continued unabated after the letter. Bagnall, showing that Integrationist dislike for Garvey's physical features shared by Du Bois, described him as a Jamaican Negro of unmixed stock, squat, stocky, fat, and sleek, with protruding jaws and heavy jowls, small, bright pig-like eyes, and rather bulldog-like face. Boastful, egotistic, tyrannical, intolerant, cunning, shifty, smooth and suave, avaricious. Yet, due no doubt to the stress of the campaign, splits began to appear among Garvey's foes. For one thing, the campaign's strident anti-West Indian onslaught now began to embarrass its chief West Indian member, W. A. Domingo. While maintaining his anti-Garvey position, Domingo now openly attacked the messenger on this score. Owen defended the messenger's position amid more rancorous integrationist nativism. Another fissure resulted in the dismissal of Floyd J. Calvin from his post as associate editor of the Messenger. Calvin's mistake had been to suggest that Randolph and Owen should not seek to bring about the destruction of the whole of Garvey's organization merely because Garvey may have erred. Mild as this criticism was, it cost him his job. As if to underscore their disagreement with Calvin, the Messenger editors declared in April 1923, "Our work is bearing fruit. The Black Star Line is completely gone. Every one of his stores is closed. His Negro Times is suspended. And well nigh all of his former employees are suing him for pay." The campaign had by now degenerated to the point where a Messenger cartoon could depict Garvey as a donkey and describe him as a well-known jackass. The campaign did not let up during Garvey's trial, and during the post-trial imprisonment without bail, the Messenger urged the total destruction of the UNIA now that Garvey was in jail, since it represented a continuance of Garvey's spirit. Garvey was out of jail in time to congratulate his supporters for having contributed to George Harris's defeat in Harlem primaries. Harris, one of the 8, had some time previously been the lone objector to a UNIA-sponsored celebration, even though his white colleagues on the board of aldermen had given their approval. And Pickens, after publishing an article in which he reversed the good he had to say about Garvey in 1921, wrote the prosecutor expressing his impatience at the delay in disposing of Garvey's case now that he was out on bail. Du Bois's lunatic or traitor attack in 1924 was warmly applauded by the Messenger, which came to his defense in the face of the widespread disagreement it generated. The editors were so pleased that they said they felt like rescinding all their previous criticisms of Du Bois. Du Bois, they said, was an intellectual giant. Garvey was but a low-grade moron. Garvey lost his appeal in February 1925, and Pickens rejoiced. An interesting aside on the tragedy and comedy of Pickens's role in this campaign is the fact that late in 1924, he again extracted a salary increase from the NAACP by using the same tack as in 1921. He claimed that he had passed up a chance to get a substantial increase from a similar organization. In his first application for pardon in June 1925, Garvey pointed out that Pickens had acted in a provoking and unbecoming manner in the courtroom during the trial, and that Abbott, another of the 8, had brought the first Mrs. Garvey back into the country and featured her pronouncements in his Chicago Defender in order to prejudice his trial. By 1926, George Harris was not above boosting the circulation of his New York News by organizing a petition, supposedly on behalf of Garvey, and publishing Garvey's memoirs, the latter in fact written by a prosecution witness at Garvey's trial. As in the case of the Communists, who adopted a form of black nationalism once Garvey had departed America, and as in the case of Du Bois, who began preaching separatism in the 1930s, so it was with some of the 8. Amy Jakes Garvey noted in 1927 that George Harris had warned the white world that it would have to reckon with Garvey's radical ideas and stop exploiting black people. And the Negro World noted an Abbott editorial on African redemption, complete with Garvey phraseology. Of the 8, however, it was Pickens, always the most erratic and unpredictable, who came out openly for Garvey's release in 1927. He said, however, that he would have preferred deportation to prison for Garvey from the beginning. The Marcus Garvey Must Go campaign as has been noted, was essentially an alliance of convenience between integrationists, many of whom had been at loggerheads with one another before Garvey's successes drove them to temporary unity. Once Garvey had gone, the basis for their unity went with him. Thus, less than a year after Garvey's imprisonment, the Messenger was editorially attacking Abbott. Even before that, they had turned on former Attorney General Dougherty, who was now, in their opinion, notorious for his crooked, shady political dealings. And in 1928, Owen and Randolph launched an attack on yet another of the eight, George Harris. The relationship between the UNIA and the Integrationists was one of overwhelming but not unrelieved hostility. Occasionally, as in the case of the Dreyer Bill, they were willing to cooperate where the interests of black people might otherwise suffer severely. Thus, in 1922, at the height of Du Bois's attacks, John Edward Bruce was willing to join him on a Fair Play League, which would visit police stations in Harlem to try to ensure the proper treatment of black prisoners. As in the case of relations with the communists, however, this type of cooperation was more likely to take place after Garvey's deportation from the United States, when the UNIA gradually receded as a threat to the integrationist establishment. In 1931, the Negro World sided with the NAACP against communist exploitation of the Scottsboro case, and in the middle of the decade, a meeting sponsored by the UNIA and the Provisional Committee for the Defense of Ethiopia featured Walter White and Du Bois, now in his separatist phase, as speakers. In 1944, the same year in which he rejoined the NAACP, Du Bois actually solicited the help of Amy Jakes Garvey in attracting delegates to the Fifth Pan-African Congress. When the Congress convened in Manchester, England in 1945, the Jamaica UNIA was among the delegations represented. These instances of cooperation were, however, relatively minor and mostly very late in the day. They in no way detract from the fact that a major portion of the responsibility for Garvey's imprisonment and deportation must be attributed to the integrationist onslaught, especially as manifested in the campaigns of Du Bois and the NAACP and the black socialists Owen and Randolph. Chapter 12: The Ku Klux Klan, White Supremacy.
Okay, we're gonna stop there. That completes chapter 11, NAACP and Integrationists. Sister Diane, is that you on the iPad? Any questions or comments in regards to the reading? And again, I know we read some of the first half of the chapter a couple weeks back, but um, any observations?
Yeah, question. The Messenger, what organization was that paper from?
Uh, I can look it up really quick. I'm not 100% sure.
Okay. I, I'll go back and find it. Thank you.
Good question. Thank you. Messenger.
Thank God every day to one and all.
Great guy every day, Brother Moyama. Messenger, early 20th century political and literary magazine by and for African American people in the United States. Important to the flowering of Harlem Renaissance. Initially promoted a social political view. Messenger was co-founded New York City by Chandler Owen and A. Philip Randolph. So that was their publication.
Thank you.
Yes, sir. Thank you. Co-founded in 1917. Brother Morima, you want to say something?
No. Well, I mean, there's a lot I can say, but yeah, it was that was one of my favorite chapters in Race First. It's a lot of information to cover in that kind of goes by too fast. He covered a whole lot of important info, but he also kind of omitted some as well. But yeah, that is probably one of the best chapters he has in the book. Kind of lays out some of the disputes between certain popular figures back then, and his characterization of many of those jerks who pretended to be leaders and how they corralled together to attack Mr. Garvey, knowing they were all attacking one another just months beforehand. Was really one of the biggest miracles I've ever seen performed. I mean, having people who hate each other can really rally, not to defend themselves from the white man, but to rally together and overcome all their issues with one another to attack a black man and try to get him incarcerated or ran out of the country. It was a disgraceful act, and yeah, all of them should be damned for that one. And I don't know how Messenger was supposed to be so much a contributor to the Harlem Renaissance. I mean, it wasn't the best circulating paper in the world, and it was very narrow-minded. But anyway, I guess people will say that. People tried to say that even who's that? Elaine Locke, a Howard professor, because he wrote the book The New Negro, and somehow he was the father of the Harlem Renaissance. But that was soundly defeated by Dr. Tony Martin in a debate he had with Skip Gates. Skip Gates had to concede that Marcus Garvey was the father of the Harlem Renaissance, and that was proven in his book Literary Garveyism. I think it was Literary Garveyism. Yeah, Literary Garveyism. So, but one of Elaine Locke's students, Nnamdi Azikiwe, who was one of his students at Howard University, and also a staunch Garveyite and UNIA member. He kind of settled that dispute years ago when he said himself that Mr. Garvey was the father of the Harlem Renaissance, but he considered Elaine Locke the leading spokesman for it or articulator of it or something like that. So Elaine Locke's book came too late in that cycle. But anyway, that it was a lot about some of the different people with who actually hated each other, who hypocritically spoke on so many levels. I used to laugh myself to death looking at what W.E.B. Du Bois was talking about when he was talking about he went from super talented 10th integrationist to staunch black nationalists, talking about we need a nation within a nation. When the white folks decided to cut off his purse strings and made him during the Great Depression, they weren't giving him no money no more. So he decided black folks need to come together and pool their resources and do these great things. But I'm like, weren't you just attacking Mr. Garvey for saying the same thing? So all of his intellectual integrationist friends saw him and were very unconvinced with his new, all of a sudden, black nationalist philosophy. And they laughed at half Negro to scorn. And the way, the E. Franklin Frazier came out and got him, boy, you can put that on Dave Chappelle's show. He lit him up like a Christmas tree. And yeah, it's important the way, that story went because, E. Franklin Frazier was staunch Du Bois follower at one point. He was I think when he was at Howard in 1912, he was the first vice president of the NAACP chapter at Howard, and they invited the boys down, and he was just kissing us behind. And somehow he went from that to slamming Du Bois every chance he got for being a fake black nationalist. But anyway, it was, I mean, they didn't put Kelly Miller into the mix, but he really slammed a lot of what they were doing at the time. When later on, Carter G. Woodson would do some similar criticisms. He himself kept walking a tightrope when it came to Mr. Garvey and tried to act like he don't want to take a position on a lot of matters. But privately, he knew where he stood. It was just, again, kind of disgraceful as far as I'm concerned.
Hmm. Yeah, the disagreements I thought was, that was an interesting note. It just seemed as though that the anti-Garvey group, this was a group of negative energy. They didn't even really like each other. But you mentioned before they got together, they were, nitpicking with one another. But then after, also after Mr. Garvey was deported, they still found a way to attack one another. So I just feel like negative people are going to be negative people.
Let me tell you about those Negroes hating like Satan when Mr. Garvey came on the scene and bypassed all of them, dwarfed everybody's movement all at once. And funny thing is, it's almost like if Mike Tyson came on the scene and everybody else was pretty much even when it came to boxing. He came and started knocking everybody out in the first round. And instead of getting their game up and learning to be better pugilists, boxers all come together and try to get him thrown out of the boxing league because they can't beat him. It's tantamount to what these disgraceful clowns tried to do to Mr. Garvey. Try to go to run to the white man and, please get him out of the country because we can't do nothing with him. And the people are listening, the people are loving them, the people are growing, and all of our, craziness is being ignored and disregarded. So, I mean, even like Du Bois, when he would come against Mr. Garvey, he wanted to slam the Black Star Line when he had every chance he had an opportunity. He would try to, tell people that, Marcus Garvey is coming to kill all white people, and Marcus Garvey's ships are made of wood. Y'all gonna fall to your death. And how you look, somebody trying to, you trying to put together a shipping line, engage in trade and commerce and transport people. And one of the loudest mouths in the, in the community is going around telling everybody you're gonna die if you get on that ship, and all your goods are gonna be destroyed, and all this stuff is gonna happen to you. You won't have a lot of faith in those products if you listen to this type of foolishness. But this was a level of sabotaging aside from all the throwing ships in the, objects in the ship engine and all this other craziness that they were trying to engage in to sabotage everything he was doing. But I mean, this is, these are volunteered Uncle Toms for Uncle Sam, deliberately trying to undermine a black man's empire, industrial empire, commercial empire, political empire, and everything. That after he's off the scene, all of them now all of a sudden want to write Garvey should be pardon letters. And that was the new thing after they all got him railroaded and wrongfully convicted in this prison, and all these silly comments out about him. Now everybody want to be sympathetic and show themselves to be the hero. But the games that they played is so treacherous. It's you can't talk enough about them as far as I'm concerned. Du Bois at one time after the ships had gotten seized, he had the nerve, the unmitigated gall, to write a letter to Charles Evans Hughes, who was the State Department, Secretary of State, and ask him if he would agree to release the ships to Du Bois and some of his friends so they can operate the ships in the shipping line. The same ships he told them was made of wood and raggedy. He wants to take control of it, not by putting his money together and buying them, but he wants white man to give it to him. The same, white man that he was begging to go over to Liberia as a diplomatic agent or minister plenipotentiary and go there and represent the U.S. government at Charles Dunbar Burgess King's presidential inauguration, where he sabotaged the UNIA representing Firestone and one of their lenders, making these little fake agreements with Liberian government, and under all it's so much dirt along the way that I would need 3-4 hours at least to just talk about Du Bois alone and all the sneaky, underhanded, crooked stuff this clown did. Yet every time they ask him about his opinion of Garvey, oh, I don't know what you're talking about. I didn't say anything about Garvey. I never did anything against Mr. Garvey. I'm just a victim. I don't know what you're talking about. But just the biggest snake ever. And yeah, people in Ghana always talking about, Garvey, the boys should have worked together and all this crazy. They out of their rabbit mind. Thinking Mr. Garvey should work with the damn devil incarnate. I wish I can go over to the boys' center now, where he's buried in Ghana, dig him up and flush him down the dirtiest toilet in Europe somewhere where he belongs. And that's why we voted him out of the race, that disgraceful clown that he was. And no love whatsoever for him. Got more love for Adolf Hitler, Clarence Thomas, and a whole lot of other folks. And I got for some WB of confusion, Du Bois. But yeah, the more you learn about that fool, boy, makes you angry. I make you want to put some hands on him if he was still around. How badly he betrayed this race every chance he got. Even with that closed ranks article he wrote during the wartime, telling us to go fight and die for America, because the white man told him to write it. So, and this is right after black soldiers got lynched in uniforms. You come all forget your grievances with America. Man up and go fight and die for this cracker. And boy, and some people actually, if you remember, in fact, if you all remember the original Roots, Alex Haley's father, when he was working and attending Tuskegee Institute. They had a scene in there in the original Roots where he was following the message of Booker T until Booker T passed away. Then he said, well, W.B. Du Bois is the new leader now. He's telling us we ought to go to war. So I'm going to go fight for my country. And this is the kind of reaction that some of them ignorant people back in that day, had to his words, thinking he was a sincere, educated, brilliant leader looking out for their best interests, and all the while trying to undermine them, so he can get, a commission as a captain in the military intelligence division of the Negro Subversion Division of Military Intelligence, I should say. But it is just a dirty, dirty group of people, man, all the way around. Pickens, all of them. Definitely Abbott. And Bagnall, they talked about. That's the one they wanted in Detroit when Mr. Garvey first came to the U.S. Was he was in, Mr. Garvey sat in the front row of the church. They're coming to, they're here to pass the speak. So when they, but he didn't know that was called, I forgot what they used to call that. Basically, it's like red bone heaven or something like that they used to call it. But the first 2 rows of the church were reserved for the light skinned people, those who had some, white, mixed in their blood. So anyway, when Mr. Garvey came, sat in the front row. Boy, that pastor went off, started rolling up his sleeves, about ready to get in a fist fight. Marcus Garvey was sitting in the light skinned people section. And I mean, the tomfoolery of these clowns who wanted to be respected as leaders and putting us through all this kind of craziness. It's disgraceful when you look back and think about what Mr. Garvey had to deal with. We've been better off dealing with pure enslaved people than dealing with these kinds of nuts. But yeah, anyway, he advanced us, took us a lot further. So thank God for him and his ability to endure these Yeshua, or Jesus, we call it poisonous snakes. These ones who want to strain out the gnat, but gulp down the bull is that biblical example. Anyway, but that's a long, strong topic there.
Yes, thank you, Brother Moyama. So yeah, as I said, Sister Diane wasn't able to host tonight. We'll pick up next week, probably with some questions. And we'll probably, I think we're gonna end up going to the end of the month, possibly, but it's supposed to be an examination, a comprehensive examination at the end of the course, but Sister Diane will provide more updates. But I don't have anything else for tonight, brothers and sisters. If there's nothing else, we will close out.
Might listen to some of that debate going on, I guess. The
Vice President's
Not-
debating.
yeah, not that it's gonna sway me one way or another, but it just would be interesting to see how they come at each other. You know, people talk about this war going on with Iran and, you know, Israel, and how bad and tragic, and they could, you know, expand, Russia get involved and all this. And folks are just, you know, don't know what side to take. But when I see white folks and Arabs fighting each other, the same ones who've been historically our enemies for too long, killing each other, you know, all I do is get a bag of popcorn and watch. I'm not going to get in the middle of that one.
Yeah.
Kind of remind me of Malcolm X years ago when they asked him a question. They said, Malcolm, it's been said that you're the only black man in America who can start a race war or stop a race war. And he told him, well, I don't know if I want to start a race war. Then he told him I wouldn't know if I want to stop one either. So, yeah, when folks, you know, your enemies coming together to kill each other, that's when you prepare during times of peace, prepare for war. Because after they finish with each other, they coming after you. And, yeah, you know, unfortunately for us, as in the Civil War and as in the European War I and II, sometimes, you know, Africa got its freedom at the urging and at the lobbying and at some of the fighting of African leaders, but it also mainly got their freedom, not because of no Pan-African Congress or none of that stuff that we like to pretend was the catalyst. But they got their freedom, you know, yeah, Mr. Garvey and others influence and all that, but they got their freedom because Europe was too weak to continue to colonize. After World War, or quote unquote World War I, was destroy their military capacity to even maintain their local, you know, streets and keep peace at home. They certainly had no power to regulate militarily anybody abroad. So, you know, the nations were already free. I don't even know why they even went through the process of negotiating and setting up commonwealths and all this kind of stuff, just to appease Europe. But, you know, the fight was over. You know, you could have sent a few barefooted tribes from Africa to Europe and conquered all of it if we wanted to. That war was, you know, over. So that so-called independence we got, that flag independence in many places in Africa, that wasn't about nothing. You know, that was like, you know, telling us we free, but not really having us free, or like taking the dog off a leash and letting them run in the backyard and say, you free now, boy, but you still can't go inside this gate. You know, so it was that fake freedom. But yeah, when white folks go to war, yeah, you know, we can sometimes get a little rhythm if we're smart and, you know, play our position right. So yeah, let them do their thing. Let devils be devils. And yeah, that's you know, kind of what Mr. Garvey was talking about on the war section of the course of African philosophy. You know, how to be thinking ahead. You know, while the other folks are doing their thing, fighting over the spoils of Africa, or you know, being greedy. So yeah. So now this is not the final chapter though, right?
No, there's one more chapter, chapter 12.
Yeah, that's what I thought. Okay. Yeah. Okay.
So
Yeah,
but that's a shorter chapter. I think we can get through the reading of that chapter in one session.
Yeah, that's a shorter one. I think the assimilation is one of the biggest, if not the biggest. But it's man, it was so much to unpack in that. You know, you really almost need 3 weeks to go through that piece and to understand it. I always laugh when I think about Mr. Garvey and his lawsuit with Cyril Briggs, who was the head of the African Blood Brotherhood, the so-called Black Socialist Communist group. Who, you know, these were the radicals who supposedly was trying to instigate some things down in Tulsa before the thing before the riots broke out. You know, then they, you know, tried to switch blame and say Garvey movement was doing it. But anyway, Cyril Briggs was the a very, very pale gentleman to be Negro. And Mr. Garvey on one occasion called him a white man. And he decided to take Mr. Garvey to court for libel for calling him a white man. And Mr. Garvey testified in court. They asked him, well, Mr. Garvey, did you call him a white man? He said, yes, I said it, and he still is a white man. They said, well, you know, he's a Negro. I didn't say he wasn't a Negro. He's just a white Negro. You know, when I said white, I'm talking about his complexion. That's what he looks like to me. He looks like a white man. But if I didn't say that's what his race, I just say that's what his complexion, you know. So, but it was just funny the way Mr. Garvey handled it. You know, he didn't backpedal. He said what he meant and meant what he said. White man. But yeah, he was time enough. Him, Bruce, Fortune, and Ferris, the editors of the Negro World, boy, they lit them folks up. Like the 7 Little Colored Men, the 3 Blind Mice articles. They were just having a field day with these intellectuals and making them look stupid every step of the way. But yeah, anyway, yeah, it was a great subject.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Anyone else? Any closing comments, questions?
Yeah, this was a great subject, man. I really learned a lot. Thank y'all.
Yes. Hopefully, I'm gonna leave it to our Sister Diane to further unpack the lesson. We got through the reading. All right, brothers and sisters, we're gonna close out and get some rest. Get ready for tomorrow. If everyone would, please come off mute. Repeat after me. One God.
One God.
One aim.
One
aim.
One destiny.
One destiny.
Africa.
Africa.
For the Africans.
For the
Africans.
Those at home.
Those at home.
And those abroad.
And those abroad.
Race first, family. Go in peace.
Race first, family.
Race first.